In the heart of New Orleans, amid the hum of streetcars and the aroma of Creole cooking, a young man named Carlos Marcello began weaving a life that would eventually ripple across the entire southern United States. Born Calogero Minacor in 1910 in Sicily, his family immigrated to the United States when he was just a child. They settled in the French Quarter, a neighborhood alive with music, culture, and the subtle undertow of organized crime. From the very beginning, Marcello witnessed the complex dance of ambition and survival that shaped his community. Streets weren't just thoroughfares, they were arenas where influence, respect, and sometimes fear determined one's destiny. Marcello's early life was marked by the realities of immigrant existence. His parents worked tirelessly to make ends meet, instilling in him a sense of discipline and an understanding of the value of power and protection. But it wasn't long before he realized that survival in New Orleans required more than hard work. It demanded connections, respect, and a deep understanding of human nature. While other children played on the sidewalks, young Carlos observed the interactions of local businessmen, street vendors, and figures whose reputations commanded attention. He absorbed lessons in negotiation, patience, and the subtle art of influence, a foundation that would serve him well in the decades to come. By his late teens, Marcello began working within the local criminal underworld. He started with small-scale operations, including loan sharking and gambling, areas that required shrewd calculation and a quiet demeanor. Unlike some of his contemporaries who sought immediate recognition through flashy violence or public displays, Marcello cultivated a strategy of discretion. His philosophy was clear. Power was most effective when it moved silently, unnoticed, like an undercurrent shaping the tides without drawing attention to itself. This approach earned him the nickname the Quiet Emperor, a title that would later define his reign over organized crime in the southern United States. Marcello's ascent wasn't instantaneous. It was a meticulous process built on patience and strategic alliances. He recognized early that control wasn't just about fear. It was about loyalty, influence, and an understanding of the broader social and political landscape. In New Orleans, law enforcement often operated under the influence of political machines, and politicians themselves navigated a delicate balance of power between public service and private interests. Marcello learned to exploit these nuances, building networks that connected local businesses, police, and politicians. By the 1940s, he had firmly established himself as a central figure in the southern criminal landscape, respected by peers and feared by rivals. One of the most defining aspects of Marcello's rise was his ability to adapt. The post-war era brought economic changes, expanding industries, and shifting demographics. He recognized the opportunities in emerging gambling operations, racketeering, and union influence, and positioned himself at the intersection of these ventures. Unlike many mob figures of the time who relied on overt displays of violence to assert dominance, Marcello exercised what historians often describe as silent authority. He would make decisions, settle disputes, and exert control without unnecessary attention, ensuring that his influence spread like a quiet but inescapable shadow across the South. Marcello's life was also shaped by the constant presence of external threats. Federal authorities, rival families, and political challengers all sought to curtail his influence, yet his approach to conflict was calculated. He prioritized strategy over confrontation, using negotiation, persuasion, and sometimes covert pressure to achieve objectives. This method allowed him to survive legal challenges, outmaneuver rivals, and maintain a degree of public invisibility. To the outside world, he was an enigmatic figure. To those who knew him, he was a master of patient strategy and subtle intimidation. Beyond the mechanics of power, Marcello's story offers a reflection on human ambition and the consequences of influence. His life illustrates how individuals navigate systems of opportunity and risk, and how the pursuit of control, if left unchecked, can impact communities, law, and culture. Marcello's legacy is a complex tapestry, a study in leadership, intelligence, and strategic foresight, but also a cautionary tale about the seductive nature of unchecked power and the ethical boundaries that are often blurred in its pursuit. By the end of the 1950s, Carlos Marcello had firmly cemented his role as the dominant force in the Southern Mafia. His quiet influence extended from New Orleans to neighboring states, affecting business, politics, and society in subtle but profound ways. He remained a figure who moved in the shadows, orchestrating events with the precision of a seasoned strategist. His rise wasn't marked by sensational headlines, but by the careful accumulation of respect, fear, and loyalty, a testament to the enduring power of patience and calculated action. Marcello's story reminds us that true power does not always announce itself with fanfare. It often grows quietly, nurtured by observation, discipline, and strategic thinking. Yet it also reminds us of the human cost of ambition pursued without moral restraint. The streets he walked, the deals he made, and the networks he built all left indelible marks on his city and its history. His life challenges viewers to consider the delicate balance between ambition and ethics, strategy and responsibility, influence and accountability, a lesson as relevant today as it was in the mid-20th century. By the early 1960s, Carlos Marcello had transformed from a rising figure in New Orleans into a central power broker of the Southern Mafia. His reputation as the Quiet Emperor was no accident. It reflected years of careful planning, observation, and strategic alliances. He understood that controlling a criminal empire was not about overt displays of force alone. True authority required influence over those who could both help and hinder your ambitions, including law enforcement officials, politicians, business leaders, and rival factions. Marcello's genius lay in his ability to navigate these complex relationships with precision, building a network that spanned cities, states, and industries, all while keeping his personal visibility to a minimum. Marcello's approach to power was methodical. Unlike the stereotypical gangster who relied on intimidation and violence, he prioritized subtlety and long-term planning. He expanded into gambling operations, recognizing the profitability of casinos, betting parlors, and numbers games, while maintaining strict discipline among those who worked for him. This careful oversight reduced exposure to law enforcement scrutiny and minimized internal conflicts, a common weakness among competing crime families. In addition, he forged strong ties with influential politicians who knowingly or unknowingly provided protection for his enterprises. By the 1960s, Marcello was not merely a crime boss. He had become a figure who could subtly influence the social, political, and economic landscape of the South. One of the key elements of his strategy was his understanding of timing. Marcello knew when to act, when to negotiate, and when to remain invisible. He avoided unnecessary confrontations that could draw unwanted attention, instead cultivating loyalty and fear in equal measure through quiet, calculated methods. Rivals often underestimated him, mistaking his calm demeanor for passivity. This misjudgment proved fatal for many who tried to challenge his authority. By letting others make hasty decisions while he remained measured, Marcello maintained control without drawing public scrutiny. During this period, the Southern Mafia faced increasing pressure from federal authorities. The 1960s saw a surge in anti-organized crime initiatives, with the FBI and other agencies using surveillance, informants, and legal strategies to disrupt criminal networks. Marcello responded with caution and ingenuity. He implemented a layered operational structure, compartmentalizing his organization so that even if a lower-level operative was apprehended, the higher echelons remained insulated. This structural sophistication reflected his broader philosophy. Influence and power are most enduring when they are protected by intelligence, not just force. Marcello's relationships with politicians were particularly notable. He understood that the machinery of governance could be as useful as any enforcement network. By cultivating connections with key figures in Louisiana and beyond, he ensured that his interests were subtly safeguarded. Bribery was not always overt. Often, it was the careful exchange of favors, information, and strategic support that cemented his influence. The result was a landscape where Marcello could operate with relative impunity, quietly steering events to his advantage while maintaining an image of respectability. Despite his external success, Marcello's world was far from without risk. Rival factions, jealous subordinates, and federal investigators all posed threats that required constant vigilance. Yet, he approached these challenges with the same calm, calculated mindset that had defined his rise. Confrontation was a last resort. Negotiation, persuasion, and strategic compromise were his tools of choice. This approach not only preserved his power, but also minimized the internal violence that often tore apart other criminal organizations. By the mid-1960s, Marcello's empire was both expansive and remarkably stable, a testament to the efficacy of his methods. Marcello's influence extended beyond crime and politics. It touched the cultural fabric of New Orleans itself. Casinos and gambling halls were hubs of entertainment, drawing locals and tourists alike, while his network of business connections helped shape local commerce. While these enterprises operated outside the law, they also provided employment and social structures that influenced the city's economy and culture. In a way, Marcello's empire mirrored the duality of power, outwardly dangerous yet internally organized, influential, and quietly transformative. The 1960s also marked a period of growing national attention on organized crime. High-profile investigations and hearings brought figures like Marcello into the public eye, though often indirectly. He was skilled at controlling the narrative, ensuring that his name remained associated with strategic influence rather than scandalous violence. This control of perception was central to his long-term survival. While federal authorities investigated, Marcello continued to operate, carefully avoiding the missteps that had ensnared less disciplined contemporaries. However, his quiet approach did not mean he avoided decisive action when necessary. Disputes over territory, loyalty, or operational control were resolved swiftly, but usually in a way that minimized exposure. By relying on trusted lieutenants and an extensive intelligence network, Marcello could make informed decisions without resorting to public confrontation. The result was a balance of power and fear that reinforced his dominance while protecting the integrity of his organization. Marcello's story during this period offers a deeper lesson about influence. True power is rarely loud. It is exercised through strategy, relationships, and an understanding of human behavior. He demonstrated that the most effective leaders, criminal or otherwise, combine patience, intelligence, and adaptability. At the same time, his life illustrates the moral complexities inherent in unchecked ambition. While he achieved remarkable organizational control, the methods he used caused real harm, reinforcing the lesson that influence without ethics is ultimately destructive. By the late 1960s, Carlos Marcello had become synonymous with Southern organized crime. His empire was resilient, his authority respected and feared, and his strategies studied by both law enforcement and fellow gangsters. Yet, he remained an enigmatic figure, rarely appearing in public, his true power understood only by those who navigated the shadows of his world. His story challenges us to reflect on the fine line between leadership and manipulation, between ambition and morality, and between influence and exploitation. Marcello's rise during this period demonstrates the enduring principle that careful observation, strategic patience, and an understanding of human networks can achieve extraordinary results. But it also reminds us that power without accountability, however skillfully exercised, carries profound consequences. His life in the 1960s stands as both a historical record of Southern Mafia dominance and a cautionary tale about the seductive allure of unchecked ambition. As the 1970s dawned, Carlos Marcello's Southern Mafia empire had grown in size, sophistication, and influence. His name carried weight not only in New Orleans but across state lines, reaching into Texas, Mississippi, and beyond. The empire he built was no longer just a collection of gambling operations, businesses, and political connections. It had become a structured, interwoven network capable of withstanding both internal and external pressures. Yet, with prominence came scrutiny. Federal authorities, now increasingly focused on organized crime, began closing in on Marcello, setting the stage for one of the most intense periods of his life. Marcello understood that visibility was dangerous. He rarely appeared in public, relying instead on intermediaries, trusted lieutenants, and carefully constructed layers of operations to shield himself. These layers acted as both a defensive mechanism and a strategic tool. While lower-level operatives handled day-to-day transactions and gambling operations, Marcello stayed above the fray, observing, directing, and planning his next moves with precision. This structure ensured that even if law enforcement made arrests or conducted raids, the core leadership remained insulated, a testament to his meticulous organizational skills. Federal authorities were determined to dismantle the Southern Mafia, and Marcello quickly became a top target. Investigators studied his connections, financial records, and patterns of influence, aiming to expose the scope of his criminal empire. Yet, Marcello remained a step ahead. He relied on intelligence networks that provided him with early warnings of investigations and potential threats. Through loyal associates, he learned to anticipate legal maneuvers, identify vulnerabilities, and respond with calculated measures designed to protect himself and the organization. During this period, Marcello faced high-profile legal battles that tested his cunning and resilience. Federal indictments, grand jury investigations, and hearings were part of the landscape he navigated daily. Each challenge required not only legal strategy but also careful management of public perception. Marcello's approach was consistent: maintain calm, delegate where necessary, and never allow the pressure to reveal the full extent of his operations. While rivals might have crumbled under similar scrutiny, Marcello's disciplined methodology allowed him to endure and adapt. A key aspect of his survival during this era was his political influence. He had cultivated deep connections within Louisiana's political structure, including relationships with influential legislators, local officials, and law enforcement personnel. These relationships were not merely transactional, they were strategic partnerships that ensured Marcello's operations continued with minimal disruption. By the 1970s, his empire had become an invisible force, shaping the social and economic landscape of New Orleans, simultaneously feared, respected, and quietly tolerated. Marcello's ability to manipulate perception was critical during federal investigation. Unlike more overt gangsters whose visibility drew public scrutiny, Marcello maintained an aura of legitimacy. Casinos, entertainment venues, and businesses under his influence appeared ordinary on the surface, masking the intricate networks operating behind the scenes. This duality, public respectability coupled with private control, was a defining characteristic of his leadership style. It allowed him to operate under a protective veil while continuing to expand influence and consolidate power. While the legal spotlight intensified, Marcello also faced internal challenges. Maintaining loyalty within a sprawling organization required constant attention. He knew that fear alone was insufficient to ensure discipline. Loyalty needed reinforcement through rewards, trust, and respect. Disloyalty, mismanagement, or rash decisions could threaten the entire structure. Marcello relied on close advisors, careful vetting, and a combination of incentives and subtle pressure to ensure cohesion. The organization's stability, in many ways, reflected Marcello's personal discipline and strategic foresight. Marcello's story during the 1970s illustrates the delicate balance between power and vulnerability. As federal scrutiny increased, he demonstrated adaptability, intelligence, and an understanding of human behavior that was critical to survival. His empire was under threat not only from law enforcement but also from rivals seeking to exploit perceived weaknesses. By remaining calm, observing patterns, and acting strategically, Marcello neutralized these threats while continuing to expand influence. Beyond legal and organizational maneuvering, Marcello's influence touched broader societal spheres. His control over gambling, unions, and local businesses shaped the economic activity of entire neighborhoods. While these enterprises were illegal or ethically questionable, they provided employment and structure, creating a paradox in which the Southern Mafia simultaneously harmed and supported the community. Marcello's impact on the city of New Orleans serves as a case study in the complexity of power. An entity can wield destructive influence while also acting as an invisible force, shaping the local economy and society. Despite his careful strategies, the pressure from federal authorities and rival factions was unrelenting. Surveillance intensified, informants emerged, and political tides shifted. Yet, Marcello's approach remained consistent: intelligence over impulse, discretion over spectacle, patience over reaction. Each challenge was met with meticulous planning, leveraging his network of loyal associates, legal advisors, and political allies. In doing so, he not only survived, but maintained his reputation as one of the most formidable figures in organized crime history. The 1970s also highlighted the ethical lessons inherent in Marcello's story. While his strategic brilliance is undeniable, the consequences of his actions, violence, corruption, and exploitation left lasting scars on communities and individuals. His life provides a cautionary tale about the seductive nature of power when divorced from ethical responsibility. Observing his methods offers insight into leadership, strategy, and influence, but it also serves as a stark reminder that skill and intelligence must be coupled with accountability to prevent harm. By the end of the decade, Marcello had cemented his legacy as a master of subtle power. He had survived federal scrutiny, neutralized internal threats, and expanded his influence across the southern United States. Yet, his story remained complex, a mixture of strategic genius, calculated risk, and ethical ambiguity. For historians, law enforcement, and students of organized crime, Marcello's life in the 1970s provides an unparalleled example of how intelligence, discretion, and planning can shape the course of a criminal empire while highlighting the consequences of operating outside moral and legal boundaries. Marcello's life during this period underscores a timeless lesson. True influence is rarely about force or visibility. It is built on observation, strategy, relationships, and patience. At the same time, unchecked ambition, even when executed with brilliance, carries inherent risks and ethical costs. His story challenges viewers to consider how ambition and strategy can be harnessed positively, reminding us that leadership and influence must always be tempered by accountability and moral responsibility. By the late 1970s, Carlos Marcello had become more than a regional crime boss. He was a figure whose influence quietly intersected with national events and political currents. The Southern Mafia under his guidance had reached a level of sophistication that rivaled the more famous northern families, yet it remained largely under the radar of the public eye. Marcello understood that survival at this stage required more than managing gambling operations or local political allies. It demanded careful navigation of a broader, more complex web of influence that extended to Washington, D.C., and the corridors of power across the United States. Marcello's mastery of discretion remained his most potent weapon. Unlike high-profile gangsters whose names dominated newspapers, he operated in the shadows, controlling events indirectly. Businessmen, union leaders, and politicians often found themselves influenced by decisions they did not fully understand. A subtle testament to the reach of Marcello's empire. He was rarely seen, rarely mentioned, but his presence was felt in the undercurrents of power. This quiet control became his defining characteristic, and the reason he earned the moniker the Quiet Emperor. During this period, Marcello's influence intersected with national politics in ways that historians continue to examine. Allegations and conspiracy theories suggested his operations had indirect connections to major events, demonstrating the extent to which organized crime could infiltrate systems of governance without drawing direct attention. While many of these connections remain debated, what is clear is that Marcello's empire was deeply entwined with the political landscape of Louisiana and, by extension, the broader South. He understood that power was not only in controlling vice or territory, it was in shaping decisions, influencing outcomes, and anticipating the moves of those in official positions. Marcello's ability to adapt to legal and political pressure was particularly evident during this period. Federal investigations continued, and the government increasingly targeted organized crime through legislation and task forces. He responded with meticulous planning, delegating operational responsibilities while insulating himself from direct involvement. Informants, undercover agents, and congressional inquiries were met with strategic countermeasures designed to protect both his empire and personal freedom. This calculated approach allowed Marcello to withstand pressures that destroyed other criminal organizations, solidifying his reputation as a master strategist. One of the most significant aspects of Marcello's power was his understanding of human behavior. He knew that influence was most effective when exercised subtly, often appearing as coincidence or suggestion rather than overt control. Whether negotiating with politicians, resolving disputes within his organization, or managing business operations, Marcello relied on a combination of psychological insight, intelligence gathering, and careful timing. Loyalty was cultivated not through fear alone, but through a complex mix of respect, reward, and subtle intimidation, creating a stable yet flexible network capable of responding to challenges quickly. Marcello's story during this period also reflects the ethical ambiguities of power. While his organizational skill and strategic genius were remarkable, they were applied in ways that perpetuated crime, corruption, and social harm. Casinos, gambling operations, and union influence may have created employment and economic activity, but they did so under the shadow of illegal and unethical practices. Marcello's life serves as a reminder that leadership and influence, no matter how skillful, carry inherent moral responsibilities that, if ignored, leave lasting consequences for communities and individuals alike. In addition to legal pressures, Marcello faced challenges from within the criminal world. Rival factions, ambitious subordinates, and shifting alliances required constant attention. He maintained stability through disciplined management and strategic negotiation, ensuring that internal conflicts were addressed before they could escalate into public or violent confrontations. By fostering loyalty and implementing a clear chain of command, Marcello created an organization capable of surviving both external scrutiny and internal strife, a rare achievement in the volatile world of organized crime. The national stage brought both opportunities and risks. Marcello's operations intersected with political developments, union activity, and economic growth, giving him indirect influence over broader societal trends. He leveraged these intersections strategically, ensuring that his empire remained resilient, even as external conditions evolved. This ability to anticipate, adapt, and shape outcomes was central to his enduring success. While his methods were ethically compromised, the strategic lessons remained clear: intelligence, observation, and the careful orchestration of resources and relationships are powerful tools in any complex system. Marcello's interactions with the federal government, media, and political figures also highlight the importance of perception management. He understood that a gangster's power was not only in action, but in image. Public awareness of his empire was limited. He cultivated an aura of legitimacy while his operations thrived quietly beneath the surface. This duality allowed him to maintain influence while minimizing the risk of direct legal consequences. Unlike more flamboyant figures, Marcello's discretion became a strategic advantage, enabling him to operate effectively while remaining largely insulated from public scrutiny. Yet, the pressures of national attention and federal scrutiny were constant reminders of the precarious nature of power. Marcello's life illustrates a universal truth about influence: the greater the reach, the higher the stakes. Every alliance, every operation, every decision carried potential consequences. He navigated these challenges with patience, intelligence, and a deep understanding of both human nature and institutional structures. This ability to balance risk with opportunity was central to his long-term survival and the sustained stability of his empire. By the end of the 1970s, Carlos Marcello had achieved a remarkable equilibrium. He had expanded his influence, navigated national scrutiny, and maintained control over a sprawling criminal enterprise, all without succumbing to the hubris or recklessness that destroyed so many of his contemporaries. His story serves as both a historical record of organized crime in the South and a cautionary tale about the seductive power of ambition when divorced from ethical responsibility. Marcello's life challenges viewers to reflect on the nature of influence, the interplay between power and morality, and the consequences of decisions made in pursuit of authority. Marcello's legacy during this era underscores the enduring principle that effective influence is rarely loud or overt. It is cultivated through careful observation, strategic alliances, and an understanding of human behavior. At the same time, his story serves as a warning: intelligence and ambition, when applied without ethical consideration, can yield extraordinary results but also leave a trail of harm. The life of Carlos Marcello, the quiet emperor of the South, stands as a testament to the complexities of power, the nuances of leadership, and the moral responsibilities that accompany influence. As the 1980s approached, Carlos Marcello's empire had endured decades of scrutiny, legal challenges, and internal pressures, yet his influence remained remarkably resilient. By this time, Marcello was no longer the young Sicilian immigrant climbing the streets of New Orleans. He had become a seasoned strategist, a master of subtle control, and a figure whose decisions reverberated far beyond the city's limits. While younger mobsters often relied on brash tactics and public displays, Marcello continued to wield his power quietly, ensuring that his presence was felt without drawing unnecessary attention. Marcello's operations by this stage were highly structured, with layers of trusted lieutenants managing day-to-day activities. His influence extended across gambling networks, labor unions, and political spheres. Casinos, betting operations, and entertainment venues remained central to his control, but it was his ability to manipulate alliances and navigate legal and political channels that truly defined his strength. Marcello understood that influence was as much about perception as it was about action. His empire flourished because it was both adaptable and insulated, able to survive the shifting tides of law enforcement and social change. Federal authorities, however, had not forgotten him. Investigations intensified, particularly as organized crime became a national focus during the 1970s and 1980s. Marcello faced a series of indictments, surveillance operations, and legal maneuvering designed to dismantle his network. Yet, his disciplined approach allowed him to weather these storms. By delegating operational responsibilities and relying on a sophisticated intelligence network, Marcello minimized exposure while continuing to exert influence. His ability to anticipate moves and respond strategically made him a figure law enforcement often found frustratingly elusive. Marcello's quiet authority extended beyond business and criminal operations. He had long understood the importance of political connections, cultivating relationships that provided both protection and leverage. These connections were often subtle, including favors, information, or strategic support, rather than overt bribery. By the 1980s, his network had matured into a complex web of influence, allowing him to maneuver across state lines with relative freedom and continue his operations despite ongoing legal pressures. Yet, despite his careful planning, Marcello's empire was not invulnerable. Rival factions sought to exploit perceived weaknesses. Internal loyalty occasionally wavered, and law enforcement remained persistent. Each challenge required careful assessment and decisive action. Marcello's approach was consistent: act strategically, minimize exposure, and ensure the organization's integrity remained intact. This disciplined methodology allowed him to maintain stability even as external pressures increased. During these years, Marcello also reflected the paradoxical nature of power. His leadership demonstrated intelligence, patience, and strategic foresight, yet it existed within an ethical void. The human and social cost of his influence was undeniable. Gambling operations exploited communities, corruption undermined public institutions, and alliances with politically connected figures blurred the line between legality and criminality. Marcello's life provides a study in the duality of power. It can be effective, resilient, and influential, yet simultaneously harmful to those around it. Marcello's ability to maintain control in his later years highlights the importance of adaptability. As law enforcement techniques advanced, as public awareness increased, and as federal legislation targeted organized crime, he adjusted his strategies accordingly. His operational structure became more compartmentalized, intelligence networks more robust, and alliances more carefully managed. By maintaining flexibility while adhering to the core principles of discretion and patience, Marcello continued to thrive in a world that had grown increasingly hostile to organized crime. The final years of Marcello's life also underscored the personal costs of such power. Longevity and influence came at the price of constant vigilance, careful calculation, and an absence of public freedom. Unlike more flamboyant figures who embraced visibility, Marcello's life was largely lived in the shadows. His success depended on secrecy, discipline, and the management of human relationships in an environment where betrayal and ambition were constants. In this sense, his quiet empire demanded personal sacrifice as much as it demanded strategic acumen. Marcello's story during this era also offers a timeless lesson in the nature of leadership. He exemplified the power of observation, patience, and strategic thinking, showing that influence can be sustained without overt force or spectacle. Yet, the ethical dimension cannot be ignored. The brilliance of his strategy existed within a framework of criminal activity that harmed individuals, communities, and institutions. His life challenges viewers to consider the balance between skill, ambition, and morality, highlighting the consequences of unchecked influence. As Marcello approached the end of his active years, his reputation remained formidable. He was respected and feared by associates, cautiously observed by law enforcement, and studied by historians seeking to understand the dynamics of organized crime in the South. While his influence had diminished compared to his peak, the structures he had built and the alliances he had forged ensured that his legacy endured. The Southern Mafia continued to operate with many of the principles he had established, a testament to the enduring effectiveness of his leadership. Reflecting on Marcello's final years, it becomes clear that his life is a complex blend of strategy, intelligence, and ethical ambiguity. He achieved remarkable control over a vast and intricate empire, demonstrating the power of patience, discretion, and foresight. Yet, the impact of his actions reminds us that skill and ambition, when applied without regard for ethics or societal well-being, can leave deep and lasting harm. His story is a historical record, an educational case study, and a cautionary tale, a combination that makes it both compelling and instructive. Marcello's legacy, therefore, is twofold. On one hand, he exemplifies strategic brilliance, a man who rose from immigrant roots to dominate an empire through intelligence, observation, and careful planning. On the other hand, his life serves as a reminder of the moral responsibilities that accompany influence and power. Ambition without accountability, no matter how successful, carries costs that ripple through communities and history itself. The final chapter of his active life demonstrates a principle relevant to any aspiring leader or student of influence. Success is not measured solely by power, wealth, or visibility. It is also measured by the consequences of one's actions, the sustainability of one's methods, and the ethical framework within which ambition is exercised. Marcello's quiet reign, his strategic maneuvers, and his careful navigation of national scrutiny provide a masterclass in tactical influence, but also a stark reminder that true leadership requires more than intelligence. It demands moral responsibility. In the end, Carlos Marcello, the quiet emperor of the South, leaves a story that is as instructive as it is cautionary. His life teaches us that strategic patience, observation, and discretion can achieve extraordinary results, but that unchecked ambition, no matter how expertly executed, carries profound consequences. For students of history, leadership, and social influence, his story is a powerful reminder that the pursuit of power must always be balanced with ethical responsibility and awareness of the broader impact on society. Carlos Marcello's life, spanning from the bustling streets of early 20th century New Orleans to the national stage of organized crime, provides a multifaceted portrait of ambition, strategy, and the consequences of unchecked influence. By the time he reached the later years of his career, Marcello had long secured his reputation as the quiet emperor of the South, a man whose power was exercised more through intellect and subtlety than through forceful displays. His story is not only a historical account of the Southern Mafia, but also a study in leadership, morality, and the enduring complexity of human ambition. Marcello's legacy was built upon decades of meticulous planning and strategic thinking. Unlike many of his contemporaries, he avoided flamboyance and public spectacle, relying instead on discretion and patience. He understood that enduring influence requires more than temporary dominance. It requires control over information, relationships, and perception. By carefully structuring his organization and cultivating loyalty among his lieutenants, Marcello created a system capable of surviving both external legal scrutiny and internal instability. The Southern Mafia under his guidance was a testament to the power of structure, discipline, and strategic foresight. Yet, the ethical dimensions of his legacy are complex. Marcello's empire, while operationally sophisticated, was built upon illegal activity, corruption, and social exploitation. Casinos, gambling operations, and union manipulations provided him with financial power and leverage, but they also left communities vulnerable to crime, economic instability, and moral compromise. His life is a stark reminder that intelligence and strategic brilliance, when divorced from ethical consideration, can produce outcomes that are socially destructive. Observing his methods provides valuable lessons for both historians and students of leadership. Skill alone is insufficient. Ethics, accountability, and social responsibility are equally crucial components of sustainable influence. Marcello's influence extended beyond criminal operations into political and economic spheres. He understood that power could be exercised indirectly, often without public acknowledgement. Politicians, business leaders, and local officials frequently found themselves influenced by decisions and strategies that originated from Marcello's network. His ability to shape outcomes subtly without overt displays of authority reflects a profound understanding of human behavior and organizational dynamics. In many ways, his empire functioned as a quiet yet potent force, guiding events from behind the scenes while minimizing direct exposure. The Southern Mafia structure under Marcello also demonstrates the importance of adaptive leadership. Over decades, he faced numerous challenges: federal investigations, rival factions, economic changes, and shifts in public policy. In response, Marcello evolved his strategies, compartmentalized his operations, and diversified his influence. His success in doing so highlights a central principle of leadership that transcends criminality. Resilience and adaptability are key to maintaining control in a dynamic and unpredictable environment. By studying Marcello's methods, one gains insight into strategic planning, risk management, and organizational longevity. Marcello's personal style of leadership was both deliberate and paradoxical. He relied on loyalty and fear, but he also cultivated respect and reward. Employees, associates, and allies operated within a framework that encouraged disciplined performance while maintaining accountability. He rarely relied on unnecessary violence, understanding that stability, not chaos, ensured the survival of his organization. This balance between authority and subtlety exemplifies the tactical wisdom that defined his life and contributed to the durability of his empire. One of the most striking aspects of Marcello's legacy is his ability to navigate federal scrutiny and public perception. Across decades of investigation and high-profile hearings, he maintained a careful equilibrium between action and discretion. Surveillance, informants, and congressional inquiries challenged his operations, yet he responded with intelligence, patience, and calculated maneuvering. By insulating himself from direct involvement while maintaining overall control, Marcello avoided many of the pitfalls that ensnared less cautious contemporaries. His survival demonstrates the effectiveness of indirect influence and strategic planning in environments of high risk. Despite his success, Marcello's life also serves as a cautionary tale. His achievements in power and control came at the cost of legal violations, ethical compromise, and societal harm. Communities were affected by gambling, corruption, and organized crime, and many individuals suffered as a result of the structures he controlled. In this sense, Marcello's story highlights a timeless lesson. The pursuit of power without accountability, no matter how intelligent or strategic, carries significant consequences. His life offers a dual lesson in both the mechanics of influence and the moral responsibilities that accompany it. Marcello's enduring influence also provides insight into the dynamics of human ambition. From his immigrant beginnings to the apex of Southern Mafia power, he demonstrated remarkable intelligence, patience, and foresight. Yet, his story is also a reminder of the seductive nature of authority and the potential for ethical compromise. Students of history, leadership, and social dynamics can observe how strategic skill can achieve extraordinary results, while also learning from the ways unchecked. Ambition and moral ambiguity impact society and personal legacy. The Quiet Emperor's life ultimately exemplifies a principle that transcends the criminal context. True influence is exercised most effectively through understanding, patience, and discretion. Marcello's ability to achieve control over a vast network without relying solely on force or visibility is a lesson in subtlety and strategy. At the same time, the ethical consequences of his actions reinforce the importance of accountability and responsibility. Leadership, after all, is measured not only by the ability to achieve goals, but by the impact those goals have on the broader world. Marcello's story resonates beyond organized crime. It demonstrates that strategy, discipline, and foresight can yield extraordinary influence, whether in business, politics, or social leadership. However, it also reminds us that the application of such skills requires ethical grounding. Intelligence and ambition, when divorced from responsibility, can produce harm that outlasts the individual. By examining the life of Carlos Marcello, viewers are offered both an educational narrative about organized crime in the South and a broader reflection on leadership, morality, and the consequences of human ambition. In summary, the legacy of Carlos Marcello, the Quiet Emperor, is a complex interplay of brilliance and caution, influence and consequence. He built an empire that was operationally sophisticated, resilient, and strategically advanced. Yet, this same empire existed in the shadows of legality and ethics, producing both power and harm. His life teaches enduring lessons. Patience, observation, strategic thinking, and discretion are invaluable tools in leadership, but they must always be tempered by moral responsibility. For viewers, historians, and students of influence, Marcello's life is both instructive and cautionary. It demonstrates how ambition and intelligence can achieve remarkable outcomes, yet also warns that without ethical consideration, even the most brilliant strategies can leave lasting damage. The Quiet Emperor's story is, above all, a reminder that power carries responsibility, and that the truest measure of leadership lies in both effectiveness and ethical impact. By the early 1980s, Carlos Marcello had established himself not just as a master strategist of organized crime, but also as a man whose personal life and private demeanor played a critical role in sustaining his empire. While the public knew him as the Quiet Emperor of the South, few understood the careful balance he maintained between his personal relationships, professional responsibilities, and the ongoing pressures of law enforcement scrutiny. His influence was built as much on personal discipline and private networks as it was on overt operations, revealing the often unseen foundations of enduring power. Marcello's personal life was a study in contrast. On one hand, he was deeply embedded in the cultural and social fabric of New Orleans, participating in family life and maintaining ties to the Sicilian immigrant community that had shaped his early years. On the other hand, he navigated a world of secrecy where trust was scarce and betrayal could occur at any level. Balancing these two worlds required extraordinary caution. He carefully curated who had access to him and what information they could carry, ensuring that personal loyalty aligned with organizational stability. Family and close confidence were insulated from the inner workings of his operations, providing a semblance of normalcy while preserving the integrity of his empire. One of Marcello's defining traits was his ability to wield influence without overt displays of power. This applied not only to his professional operations, but also to his personal interactions. Associates and subordinates often acted out of a mixture of respect, fear, and loyalty. Understanding that Marcello's authority was absolute yet exercised subtly. Decisions were rarely abrupt. He preferred observation and measured guidance, using influence rather than coercion whenever possible. This approach strengthened relationships, reinforced loyalty, and minimized unnecessary conflict and organizational skill that many leaders outside the criminal world might study with admiration. Marcello's personal habits reflected his broader philosophy. He was disciplined, methodical, and patient, preferring to remain out of the public spotlight while letting his organization operate efficiently beneath him. Unlike flamboyant gangsters of his era, he avoided unnecessary attention, understanding that discretion was both a protective measure and a strategic advantage. This quiet approach allowed him to maintain a level of longevity rare in the criminal world, where impulsiveness and ego often led to downfall. In many ways, his life demonstrates the value of restraint, foresight, and strategic thinking in any form of leadership. During this time, Marcello's empire continued to exert influence over gambling operations, unions, and political figures. Yet, his personal involvement was limited. He delegated authority to trusted lieutenants who executed day-to-day operations. These individuals were carefully chosen, vetted for loyalty, and guided by Marcello's overarching strategy. By compartmentalizing responsibilities and maintaining clear lines of communication, he minimized risk while maximizing operational efficiency. This organizational discipline was a hallmark of his leadership and a key factor in the enduring stability of the Southern Mafia. Marcello's personal influence extended into subtle areas of politics and society. He understood that shaping perception and outcomes often required indirect action. Politicians, business leaders, and community figures frequently made decisions influenced by his network without directly realizing the source. This indirect power was a defining characteristic of Marcello's approach. It allowed him to extend control far beyond the immediate confines of his organization while reducing personal exposure. It also reinforced his reputation as a strategic and thoughtful leader, even in the morally ambiguous context of organized crime. Despite his strategic brilliance, Marcello faced personal challenges. The demands of leadership in a high-risk environment required constant vigilance, long hours, and an unrelenting focus on risk management. Trust was always tentative, and relationships had to be continually evaluated for loyalty and reliability. Even within his family, he maintained careful boundaries between private life and business operation. This constant balancing act illustrates the personal costs of maintaining influence in high-stakes environments, demonstrating that power, even when exercised discreetly, is never without pressure or sacrifice. Marcello's interactions with his associates highlight his psychological acumen. He understood that influence was as much about perception and motivation as it was about authority. Rewards, subtle persuasion, and psychological insight were often more effective than overt coercion. By managing human behavior with subtlety and intelligence, he maintained order, loyalty, and respect within his organization, a feat that many leaders outside the criminal sphere could admire and emulate in ethical contexts. The 1980s also brought new external pressures. Federal agencies continued to monitor and investigate organized crime, and shifts in political climates occasionally threatened Marcello's operations. He responded by reinforcing compartmentalization, strengthening intelligence networks, and maintaining close oversight of key figures. These adjustments allowed his empire to continue functioning effectively despite increasing scrutiny. His ability to anticipate and mitigate risk reflects an understanding of both human nature and institutional systems, further emphasizing the sophisticated nature of his leadership. Marcello's personal legacy during this period is inseparable from his organizational achievements. While he rarely appeared in public, his influence was omnipresent, shaping decisions, relationships, and outcomes throughout New Orleans and beyond. The quiet authority he exercised illustrates a timeless principle. True leadership is often invisible, built on discipline, observation, and strategic foresight rather than spectacle or intimidation. His life offers a study in how careful management of personal and professional spheres can sustain influence over long periods, even in high-risk and ethically complex contexts. Ultimately, Marcello's personal life and leadership style reinforce the broader lessons of his career. Influence requires not only strategic skill but also careful management of human relationships, discretion, and adaptability. Leadership, whether in legitimate or illegitimate contexts, is as much about psychology, perception, and decision-making as it is about authority or control. Marcello's success and the longevity of his empire was a direct result of his ability to integrate these elements seamlessly, navigating a complex world of loyalty, risk, and ambition with remarkable skill. Marcello's quiet dominance offers another enduring lesson. Resilience and foresight are key to sustaining influence. By compartmentalizing responsibilities, managing relationships carefully, and exercising patience, he was able to maintain control over a sprawling empire for decades. Yet, his story also serves as a warning about the ethical dimension of power. While his strategic brilliance is undeniable, the methods he employed came at a cost to society, communities, and individuals. Studying his life provides insight into the mechanics of influence, while underscoring the importance of moral responsibility in any pursuit of power. By the mid-1980s, Carlos Marcello had firmly cemented his position as one of the most strategic and enduring figures in American organized crime history. His quiet influence, operational sophistication, and ability to navigate both internal and external pressures created a model of leadership marked by intelligence, patience, and adaptability. However, the consequences of his actions remind us that power, no matter how skillfully wielded, must be exercised with consideration for ethics and societal impact. Marcello's story during this chapter highlights the intersection of personal discipline, strategic foresight, and organizational management. He demonstrates that effective influence is often invisible, executed through subtlety, observation, and careful planning. Yet, his life also reinforces the fundamental truth that unchecked ambition, even when executed with brilliance, carries consequences that extend far beyond the individual. The Quiet Emperor's personal life and methods provide enduring lessons about leadership, resilience, and the ethical responsibilities inherent in wielding power. By the mid-1980s, Carlos Marcello's influence, though quietly exercised, had drawn increasing attention from federal authorities and political observers alike. While his operations had always been shrouded in discretion, the expanding scope of organized crime investigations meant that even the most careful and strategic leaders were under scrutiny. Marcello's empire, with its layers of gambling, union influence, and political connections, represented a challenge to law enforcement that required a sophisticated, patient approach. In turn, Marcello's response was calculated, measured, and designed to ensure the continued survival of both his organization and his personal freedom. Federal agencies, including the FBI and the Department of Justice, had long targeted Marcello. His activities in New Orleans and the broader South were under surveillance, and investigators sought to understand the full extent of his influence. Grand jury hearings, subpoenas, and wiretaps became a consistent presence in the operations of the Southern Mafia. Despite this pressure, Marcello maintained his calm and strategic focus. He understood that impulsive actions or visible panic could compromise his entire network, and he continued to rely on his intelligence network to anticipate government moves and adjust operational tactics accordingly. Marcello's interactions with political figures became particularly significant during this period. Throughout his career, he had cultivated relationships with local and state officials, building a network of influence that provided both protection and opportunity. These alliances were not always overtly corrupt. Many were maintained through subtle favors, information exchange, and indirect support that allowed both parties to achieve goals while minimizing public exposure. By the 1980s, Marcello's understanding of political leverage had evolved into a key element of his survival strategy. His ability to influence policy and protect operations through indirect means exemplified the strategic use of relationships in power management. One of the more controversial aspects of this period involved Marcello's alleged influence on national events. Historians and journalists have explored potential connections between his network and high-profile incidents of the era, demonstrating how organized crime could intersect with political and societal developments. While many of these connections remain speculative, they underscore the reach and subtlety of Marcello's operation. His life illustrates that influence does not always manifest as visible control. Often, it exists in the unseen channels where decisions are shaped, information is exchanged, and outcomes are guided quietly but decisively. Federal scrutiny was persistent and often intense. Investigators sought to build cases using informants, surveillance, and legal mechanisms. Marcello's response was grounded in the principles that had guided his career: compartmentalization of operations, delegation to trusted lieutenants, and the maintenance of secrecy. By ensuring that the full scope of his organization was never directly traceable to him, he reduced exposure and prolonged his ability to operate effectively. This careful orchestration of risk and influence reflects an advanced understanding of organizational resilience, intelligence strategy, and human behavior. Marcello's approach to political controversy and federal investigation also highlights the role of perception in leadership. By maintaining an aura of quiet respectability, he limited the damage that public scrutiny could inflict. Casinos and business ventures appeared legitimate on the surface, while political relationships remained largely invisible to outside observers. This careful management of public image demonstrates the importance of narrative control, discretion, and strategic communication in sustaining influence, even in high-risk environments. Internal challenges accompanied external pressures during this period. Rival factions occasionally sought to capitalize on federal investigations, testing the loyalty of Marcello's lieutenants or probing the resilience of his network. He managed these threats with a combination of personal oversight, strategic reassignment of responsibilities, and subtle reinforcement of loyalty. By keeping potential threats in check while preserving organizational efficiency, Marcello maintained the stability of the Southern Mafia even under considerable pressure. His ability to balance external scrutiny with internal discipline reflects a sophisticated understanding of both organizational dynamics and human behavior. Marcello's story during these years also demonstrates the ethical complexities inherent in leadership within a criminal framework. His strategic brilliance was evident, but it was applied within a system that exploited communities, manipulated political structures, and perpetuated illegal activity. This juxtaposition illustrates the duality of influence. Intelligence and skill can achieve remarkable results, yet the moral cost may be profound. Observing Marcello's methods provides valuable lessons about strategy, patience, and leadership, while simultaneously highlighting the importance of ethics and accountability in any pursuit of power. The federal scrutiny Marcello faced culminated in multiple legal challenges. Grand jury proceedings, indictments, and courtroom strategies tested his organizational control and personal composure. Marcello responded not with panic, but with preparation. By ensuring that trusted lieutenants handled operations and that legal advisors managed the formal process, he minimized the risk of direct consequences while maintaining overall control. His ability to survive these high-pressure situations underscores a central lesson: resilience and foresight, combined with strategic delegation, are key to enduring influence. Throughout this period, Marcello's empire continued to operate effectively despite external pressures. Gambling operations, union influence, and business ventures remained active, reflecting the durability of his organizational design. This continuity demonstrates that careful planning, intelligence gathering, and strategic adaptation are essential components of any successful operation, whether in legal or illegal contexts. The Southern Mafia under Marcello remained a case study in operational sophistication, risk management, and the management of human networks. Marcello's legacy during the era of federal scrutiny and political controversy is both instructive and cautionary. On one hand, his strategic skill, patience, and intelligence allowed him to navigate extreme challenges and maintain influence over decades. On the other hand, the societal consequences of his actions remind us that leadership and ambition must be tempered by ethical responsibility. His life illustrates the enduring tension between skillful influence and moral accountability, a lesson that transcends the contest of organized crime. By the end of the 1980s, Marcello had weathered persistent legal and political pressures, demonstrating remarkable resilience. His operations remained largely intact, his influence over associates and allies was undiminished, and his personal reputation as a strategic and careful leader persisted. Yet, the consequences of his decades-long career continued to echo through communities, political structures, and law enforcement strategies, reinforcing the broader implications of unchecked ambition and ethical compromise. Marcello's experience during this chapter offers a lasting insight. Influence, no matter how intelligent or sophisticated, carries responsibility. His ability to navigate federal investigations and political controversy demonstrates the value of strategic planning, discretion, and delegation. But it also highlights the moral and social dimensions of leadership. Ambition pursued without accountability can create long-term harm, even when operationally successful. In conclusion, Carlos Marcello's navigation of federal scrutiny and political controversy illustrates the intersection of strategy, influence, and ethical complexity. His life teaches that intelligence, patience, and organizational skill are essential for enduring success. Yet they must be balanced with a commitment to accountability and ethical responsibility. The Quiet Emperor's story during these years remains a compelling lesson for leaders, historians, and students of social influence, offering both practical insights and moral reflection. As the late 1980s unfolded, Carlos Marcello faced a new reality. The world around him was changing, and with it, the nature of organized crime in the South. The Southern Mafia he had meticulously built over decades remained operational, but external pressures from law enforcement, federal oversight, and the shifting political landscape were intensifying. Younger generations of mobsters, eager to assert themselves, also began testing the boundaries of his influence, forcing Marcello to balance authority with diplomacy in an increasingly complex environment. His empire, once insulated through discretion and intelligence, now required adaptation to survive in an era of modernization, technological surveillance, and heightened public scrutiny. Marcello's decline was not sudden. It was gradual, shaped by the inevitable forces of age, legal challenges, and social change. While his organizational skills remained formidable, the demands of constant vigilance and strategic oversight were taxing. His health, both mental and physical, began to feel the weight of decades spent navigating high-risk operations. He relied increasingly on his trusted lieutenants, carefully delegating responsibilities to maintain the integrity of his empire. These deputies were well-trained, loyal, and capable, but their growing independence signaled a subtle shift in power dynamics. Marcello's role transitioned from hands-on operator to strategic overseer, guiding operations while ensuring that his long-term plans remained intact. Federal investigations continued to mount, reflecting a broader national trend toward dismantling organized crime networks. The FBI, Department of Justice, and other agencies increasingly utilized modern surveillance methods, wiretaps, and informants to penetrate the layers of secrecy that had once protected Marcello's operations. Each legal inquiry required careful attention. Marcello's approach remained methodical, delegate operational exposure to trusted subordinates, monitor developments discreetly, and maintain distance from activities that could be directly traced back to him. This continued use of compartmentalization allowed him to survive where many contemporaries had been arrested or forced into hiding. Marcello's personal reputation, however, began to face challenges from public scrutiny and media coverage. By the late 1980s, the mystique of the Quiet Emperor was tempered by an increased awareness of his influence and historical connections to political and social events. Journalists, historians, and law enforcement officials highlighted his long career and intricate control over gambling, unions, and politics. While this attention did not immediately threaten his operations, it underscored the inevitability of legacy exposure. Time and public interest inevitably cast a spotlight on even the most discreet figures. Internal dynamics also demanded attention. Younger mobsters and ambitious lieutenants occasionally questioned decisions, testing loyalty and the limits of Marcello's authority. He addressed these challenges with a combination of respect, strategic reinforcement, and subtle demonstrations of influence. Violence was used sparingly. Instead, psychological insight, relationship management, and carefully administered rewards and consequences maintained organizational cohesion. This approach reflected his enduring belief that true power is as much about perception, trust, and strategic patience as it is about overt control or intimidation. Marcello's operations during this period also faced the broader social and economic transformations of the late 20th century. The gambling industry, law enforcement priorities, and public attitudes toward organized crime were shifting. Casinos and entertainment venues began to operate under stricter regulations. Technology enabled more sophisticated monitoring, and societal tolerance for corruption diminished. Marcello had to navigate these changes while maintaining influence, a task requiring not only operational skill, but strategic foresight and adaptability. His longevity in the criminal world was a testament to his ability to anticipate societal shifts and adjust accordingly. Amid these pressures, Marcello continued to reflect the paradoxes of power. He remained a figure of strategic brilliance, demonstrating intelligence, foresight, and discipline that few could match. Yet, the ethical consequences of his actions, the exploitation of communities, manipulation of political structures, and perpetuation of illegal activities remained unavoidable. His story exemplifies a universal lesson: leadership and influence, no matter how skillful, carry responsibilities whose neglect produces long-term societal costs. For students of history, criminology, and leadership, Marcello's twilight years provide a vivid case study in the delicate balance between operational success and ethical accountability. Marcello's final years of active influence also reveal the human costs of a life devoted to power. Constant vigilance, careful planning, and management of complex relationships required personal sacrifice. Isolation from public life, guarded interactions with family, and the burden of maintaining secrecy over decades took an inevitable toll. Unlike the younger, more impulsive mobsters who often succumbed to law enforcement or violence, Marcello's survival depended on discipline and restraint, demonstrating that intelligence and strategy are essential, but not without personal cost. Legal entanglements became increasingly significant as Marcello aged. Grand jury investigations, federal indictments, and congressional inquiries continued to challenge the stability of his empire. While he successfully insulated himself from direct culpability in many cases, these pressures shaped his approach to leadership and succession planning. Marcello's focus shifted toward ensuring the continuity of his organization while protecting his personal freedom and long-term legacy. This stage of his life highlights the importance of succession planning and risk management in any organization, whether legitimate or illicit. Marcello's enduring influence was also evident in the culture and structure of the Southern Mafia. Even as external pressures mounted, his organizational principles, compartmentalization, loyalty management, and strategic discretion remained central to the operational philosophy of his associates. The systems he established decades earlier continued to function, a testament to the durability of his leadership and the careful cultivation of human and operational networks. His legacy, therefore, extended beyond his personal actions, shaping the behavior, strategy, and resilience of the organization long after his peak years. By the close of the 1980s, Marcello's empire had experienced both continuity and adaptation. He had survived decades of federal scrutiny, political challenges, and internal rivalries. His methods, discipline, observation, strategic delegation, and psychological insight ensured the survival of the organization while demonstrating the power of careful planning and strategic patience. Yet, the broader consequences of his influence, the harm to communities, the perpetuation of illegal activities, and the moral compromises remain part of his legacy, offering a cautionary perspective on the limits of ambition, divorced from ethics. Marcello's twilight years provide enduring lessons in leadership, resilience, and strategy. His ability to navigate complex organizational and societal challenges demonstrates the importance of foresight, discretion, and adaptability. At the same time, the ethical dimension of his career underscores that influence and ambition must be balanced with responsibility. The Quiet Emperor's story reminds us that power, while potent and enduring, carries consequences that extend far beyond the individual, impacting communities, institutions, and historical memory. In conclusion, the late 1980s marked a period of reflection, adaptation, and careful preservation for Carlos Marcello. His empire, though facing evolving pressures, continued to operate under the principles he had instilled decades earlier. His life illustrates the intricate interplay between strategy, influence, and morality, offering lessons that are both historical and timeless. Marcello's twilight years stand as a testament to the enduring power of intelligence, discipline, and foresight, while simultaneously reminding us of the ethical responsibilities that accompany any form of authority or leadership. As the late 1980s and early 1990s unfolded, Carlos Marcello faced the culmination of decades of scrutiny from law enforcement, politicians, and the public. While his empire had survived countless investigations, indictments, and rival challenges, the cumulative pressure of age, legal entanglements, and societal change made the maintenance of influence more complex than ever. The quiet emperor, once operating with near absolute discretion, now had to contend with a modernized justice system, advanced surveillance technologies, and a federal determination to dismantle organized crime networks nationwide. Marcello's legal battles during this period were multifaceted. Federal grand juries and ongoing investigations sought to connect him directly to gambling operations, political corruption, and union manipulation, while previous decades had allowed him to insulate himself from direct exposure through delegation and compartmentalization. The evolving legal landscape increasingly challenged those protective structures. Courtrooms became arenas not just of law but of reputation, where journalists, historians, and government officials analyzed every decision and connection he had made over his decades-long career. Throughout these challenges, Marcello remained consistent in his approach. He continued to prioritize discretion, relying on trusted lieutenants to manage operations and on legal advisors to navigate complex federal proceedings. By keeping himself physically and operationally distant from direct activities, he minimized the risk of personal conviction. Yet, this strategy required constant vigilance and intelligence gathering, reinforcing the personal and psychological toll of a life lived in perpetual risk. Even the most skilled leaders are tested by the relentless pressure of high-stakes legal scrutiny, and Marcello's resilience during these years exemplified the discipline that had characterized his entire career. Marcello's relationship with the federal government during this era also illuminates the intersection of organized crime and politics. Investigators were aware that his influence extended beyond gambling and union operations into political corridors, often shaping local decisions indirectly. While definitive evidence linking him to high-level political manipulation remained limited, the perception of influence was enough to sustain both public fascination and government focus. Marcello's careful cultivation of indirect control through favors, strategic alliances, and subtle guidance allowed him to operate in the gray areas of legality, maintaining the integrity of his empire while avoiding overt exposure. The Southern Mafia, under Marcello's guidance, had evolved into a resilient, adaptive organization. Even as legal pressures mounted, the network remained structured, disciplined, and capable of responding to both internal and external challenges. Loyalty continued to be enforced through a combination of respect, reward, and subtle psychological insight rather than overt violence. By the early 1990s, Marcello had transformed his role into that of a strategist and overseer, ensuring that the operational systems he had built decades earlier remained intact even as his direct involvement diminished. This evolution reflects a key lesson in leadership. Influence is often most enduring when it is institutionalized, not reliant solely on personal visibility or coercion. Marcello's personal life during these years was marked by a quiet introspection. The constant pressure of legal scrutiny and the knowledge that decades of actions were being publicly examined brought with it an inevitable reflection on legacy. While he had successfully protected himself from many of the legal consequences that ensnared other contemporaries, the ethical and societal implications of his life's work weighed heavily. Communities affected by gambling, union manipulation, and political corruption were reminders that influence, no matter how carefully managed, carries moral responsibility. Marcello's later years illustrate that strategic skill alone cannot mitigate the human and social consequences of one's actions. The evolution of organized crime in the South during this period also reflected the broader societal and technological changes that Marcello had to navigate. Advances in law enforcement technology, greater interagency cooperation, and new legal tools made operating an illicit network increasingly complex. Despite these challenges, the systems Marcello had put in place decades earlier, structured chains of command, compartmentalized operations, and a culture of disciplined loyalty allowed the Southern Mafia to adapt and survive. His ability to anticipate societal shifts and prepare his organization accordingly demonstrates a remarkable understanding of both human and institutional dynamics. Marcello's enduring influence in this period was therefore both a product of strategic brilliance and a cautionary tale. While his organizational skills and patience allowed him to maintain control, the ethical dimensions of his empire were inescapable. Communities had been exploited, political systems manipulated, and unions influenced for the benefit of criminal enterprise. These consequences serve as a reminder that leadership and influence, while powerful tools, carry responsibilities that extend beyond operational success. Marcello's life underscores that true legacy is measured not only by strategic achievement, but by the impact on society and individuals. The final legal battles of Marcello's career highlighted the tension between operational sophistication and moral accountability. Federal authorities were determined to hold figures like him responsible for decades of organized criminal activity, and the courtroom became a space where historical actions, ethical judgments, and strategic skill intersected. Marcello approached these proceedings with the same patience and calculation that had characterized his rise. He relied on legal strategy, careful observation, and the protection afforded by indirect involvement to navigate these pressures while preserving the structure and influence of his network. Marcello's story during this era also provides insight into the nature of power over time. Influence is not static. It evolves in response to changing conditions, legal frameworks, and social expectations. Marcello adapted by consolidating operational responsibility, strengthening loyal networks, and maintaining discretion. His longevity in the criminal world was a product of both strategic foresight and the capacity to balance risk with reward, demonstrating the intersection of intelligence, patience, and organizational acumen. By the mid-1990s, Carlos Marcello's active involvement in criminal operations had significantly decreased, yet his legacy remained formidable. The Southern Mafia continued to operate along the structural principles he had established, a testament to the durability of his methods and the effectiveness of his long-term planning. While the direct visibility of his influence diminished, the systems, alliances, and cultural norms he had cultivated persisted, reflecting the enduring nature of strategic leadership even in ethically compromised contexts. In reflecting on Marcello's final legal battles and twilight years, several lessons emerge. First, influence and power require discipline, patience, and the ability to anticipate and respond to external pressures. Second, leadership is most sustainable when it is institutionalized and not dependent solely on personal presence or coercion. Third, and most importantly, ethical responsibility is inseparable from authority. Even the most sophisticated strategy cannot erase the societal and human consequences of unethical action. Marcello's life, therefore, serves as both an instructional case study in organizational management and a cautionary tale about ambition divorced from moral accountability. Ultimately, Carlos Marcello's later years reveal a nuanced portrait of power, resilience, and consequence. He navigated legal scrutiny with intelligence, preserved organizational continuity, and maintained influence despite shifting societal and technological conditions. Yet, the broader lessons of his life emphasize the costs of ambition untempered by ethics. His story is an enduring reminder that strategy, intelligence, and foresight are essential to lasting influence, but that the true measure of leadership lies in the balance between operational success and moral responsibility. As the 1990s progressed, Carlos Marcello entered the final decade of his life, a period marked by reflection, cautious observation, and an acute awareness of the legacy he would leave behind. For decades, Marcello had maintained the Southern Mafia with unparalleled discipline, relying on strategic foresight, discretion, and carefully cultivated loyalty. Now, in his later years, he could observe the organization he had built and begin to reflect on the consequences of a life spent wielding influence in a world of secrecy, ambition, and high stakes. Marcello's reflections were both practical and philosophical. Practically, he focused on ensuring the continued stability of the Southern Mafia, even as younger members began to assume more operational responsibility. The new generation of mobsters was ambitious, often impatient, and at times less cautious than Marcello had been in his youth. While they brought energy and innovation, they also introduced risks that could destabilize the organization if not managed carefully. Marcello approached this transition as a teacher, guiding from a distance, emphasizing strategic thinking and instilling principles of loyalty, discretion, and patience that had been central to his own success. This period highlighted a critical aspect of Marcello's influence, the ability to shape culture and values within an organization. He had long understood that the strength of any network, legal or illegal, relied on shared principles and a clear understanding of expectations. By reinforcing loyalty, ethical, though within a criminal framework, codes of conduct, and disciplined operational practices, he ensured that the Southern Mafia remained cohesive and resilient, even as external pressures intensified. His mentorship of younger members reflected a commitment to continuity, emphasizing foresight and restraint over impulsive action. Beyond practical considerations, Marcello's reflections were deeply personal. He had spent decades balancing ambition with secrecy, power with discretion, and loyalty with risk management. The personal cost of maintaining such an empire was immense. Years of vigilance, isolation from broader society, and the constant pressure of potential exposure had shaped his life profoundly. Yet Marcello viewed these sacrifices not as regrets but as lessons, understanding that the exercise of influence, especially in a high-risk environment, requires discipline, patience, and a willingness to endure challenges unseen by outsiders. Marcello's interactions with the next generation of organized crime figures also reveal his understanding of human nature. He recognized that ambition, ego, and impatience were natural traits, particularly among those seeking rapid advancement. His role as a mentor involved channeling these traits productively, guiding younger members to adopt strategic patience, long-term planning, and the careful management of relationships. By emphasizing observation, foresight, and psychological insight, Marcello reinforced the organizational culture he'd established decades earlier, ensuring that the Southern Mafia retained cohesion and resilience. This era also underscored the changing nature of organized crime in the South. Legal, social, and technological shifts made traditional operations more complex, while federal agencies applied new investigative techniques and increased collaboration across jurisdictions. Marcello had always adapted to external pressures, and now he guided his successors to navigate a more interconnected and scrutinized environment. The principles he instilled, discretion, compartmentalization, strategic delegation, and loyalty remained central to organizational survival, demonstrating the enduring value of structured leadership in even the most ethically complex circumstances. Marcello's reflections were also informed by the ethical implications of his life. While his strategies and organizational acumen were extraordinary, the societal consequences of his actions could not be ignored. Communities had been exploited through gambling, union influence, and political manipulation. Ethical reflection became a necessary lens through which he could assess both his personal decisions and the structure of his empire. These considerations provide a broader educational perspective for understanding the balance between ambition, influence, and moral responsibility, lessons relevant not only to students of criminal history but to leaders and strategists in all walks of life. During these years, Marcello also reflected on the broader patterns of power, control, and influence. He recognized that his ability to operate successfully for decades had relied on subtlety rather than force, observation rather than reaction, and patience rather than impulsivity. He saw that influence extended far beyond immediate control. It was shaped by relationships, reputation, and perception. These insights, learned over a lifetime of navigating high-stakes environments, underscored the importance of strategic foresight, emotional intelligence, and disciplined execution in sustaining long-term success. Marcello's role as an elder statesman of the Southern Mafia also allowed him to assess the broader consequences of his organization's evolution. While the network remained operational, the next generation faced new challenges: heightened law enforcement attention, technological surveillance, and societal intolerance for corruption. Marcello's guidance emphasized strategic flexibility, reinforcing that the principles of organizational longevity, loyalty, structure, discretion, and foresight must evolve in response to changing conditions. His mentorship thus became a bridge between decades of experience and the emerging reality of the 1990s. Personal relationships remained central to his reflections. Marcello valued loyalty, trust, and strategic alignment above all, understanding that human relationships were the foundation of any enduring network. His guidance often extended to family, lieutenants, and associates, reinforcing the importance of ethical boundaries, discretion, and foresight. By focusing on the human element, he ensured that the lessons of his career, both successes and mistakes, would be carried forward in ways that strengthened the organization while mitigating risk. Marcello's reflections also emphasized resilience. Decades of federal scrutiny, political challenges, and internal competition had tested his resolve repeatedly. His ability to maintain focus, adapt strategies, and preserve organizational stability demonstrates a timeless lesson. Enduring influence requires not only intelligence and ambition, but also patience, self-awareness, and an understanding of human nature. The Quiet Emperor's insights remain relevant for any leader navigating complex systems of power, highlighting the interplay between strategic skill and ethical consideration. Finally, Marcello's later years reveal the inevitability of legacy. He understood that his actions, both operational and ethical, would define not only his personal reputation, but also the culture, structure, and resilience of the Southern Mafia for generations. By mentoring successors, emphasizing discipline and foresight, and reflecting on the moral consequences of influence, Marcello sought to ensure that his empire would endure responsibly, even as societal pressures continued to evolve. His story is a powerful reminder that true legacy is shaped not merely by power or wealth, but by the principles, foresight, and ethical grounding imparted to those who follow. In conclusion, the final phase of Carlos Marcello's active influence illustrates the intersection of strategy, reflection, and mentorship. His ability to guide a complex organization through decades of challenges, while preparing the next generation to navigate a changing environment, demonstrates the enduring value of foresight, discipline, and strategic thinking. Yet, his reflections also emphasize that ethical responsibility and the broader consequences of ambition are inseparable from true leadership. The Quiet Emperor's legacy provides a compelling lesson. Influence is most meaningful when it balances skill, foresight, and ethical awareness, ensuring that power is exercised responsibly and its lessons endure beyond an individual's lifetime. As Carlos Marcello entered the final decade of his life in the mid-1990s, he had transitioned fully from active operator to elder statesman of the Southern Mafia. The energy and ambition that had driven him through decades of careful planning, strategic influence, and complex organizational management were now channeled into observation, reflection, and the quiet guidance of successors. While Marcello's personal role in day-to-day operations had diminished, his influence on the organization, the community, and the broader narrative of organized crime in the South remained significant. Marcello's final years were marked by a delicate balance. He sought to preserve the legacy of the empire he had built, while stepping back from the constant pressures of operational control. The Southern Mafia had evolved into a resilient network, its structure reinforced by decades of Marcello's strategic foresight. Leadership had been delegated to a trusted cadre of lieutenants, who operated under the principles of discretion, loyalty, and careful planning that had defined Marcello's career. This transition reflects a timeless leadership lesson. Enduring influence depends not on perpetual personal involvement, but on the cultivation of capable successors and sustainable organizational systems. Despite stepping back, Marcello remained acutely aware of the social and ethical consequences of his life's work. Communities had been shaped, and in many cases exploited by the operations he had overseen. Gambling networks, union influence, and political manipulation brought wealth and power to his organization, but also carried social costs. Families, local businesses, and civic institutions had been affected by his actions, demonstrating that influence, no matter how strategically wielded, has consequences that extend beyond the immediate sphere of control. Marcello's later reflections acknowledge these realities, highlighting a growing awareness of responsibility that had perhaps been less visible during the height of his operational years. Health became a pressing concern during these final years. Decades of stress, vigilance, and high-stakes decision-making inevitably took a toll. The physical strain of managing an empire, combined with the mental demands of constant surveillance and legal scrutiny, contributed to a gradual decline in energy and resilience. Yet, even as he faced these personal challenges, Marcello's strategic mind remained active. He continued to monitor developments within the organization, provide guidance to successors, and assess the evolving criminal landscape with the analytical precision that had defined his life. Marcello's withdrawal from active operations also allowed for greater focus on historical reflection. He examined the choices he had made, the strategies that had ensured survival, and the ethical compromises that had been part of the exercise of power. This period of reflection reinforces an important educational insight. Leadership, particularly in complex and morally ambiguous contexts, demands both practical skill and self-awareness. Marcello's life demonstrates that understanding the consequences of one's actions is as vital as the execution of strategy, and that reflection can provide critical guidance for the next generation. During this era, Marcello maintained relationships with loyal associates, family members, and select community figures. These interactions were characterized by careful observation, subtle mentorship, and the ongoing reinforcement of organizational values. He emphasized strategic patience, long-term planning, and ethical consideration, even within a framework of organized crime. His guidance extended beyond operational advice to include lessons on decision-making, risk assessment, and human behavior skills that transcended the criminal context and offered insight into leadership in any domain. Marcello also observed the broader societal changes that were reshaping organized crime. Law enforcement agencies had become increasingly sophisticated, employing technology, interagency cooperation, and international coordination to disrupt illicit networks. Gambling regulations had tightened, union oversight increased, and public scrutiny of corruption and organized crime intensified. The Southern Mafia, though resilient, was adapting to these new conditions under the principles Marcello had instilled decades earlier: compartmentalization, discipline, loyalty, and strategic delegation. His understanding of adaptive leadership allowed the organization to maintain cohesion and operational effectiveness even as the external environment evolved. Ethically, Marcello's reflections highlight the dual nature of influence. While he had achieved remarkable operational success, the human and societal costs of his career were undeniable. The exploitation of communities, manipulation of political systems, and perpetuation of illegal activity underscore the moral responsibilities inherent in any exercise of power. Marcello's later years illustrate a crucial lesson: intelligence, strategy, and patience must be paired with ethical awareness, or the legacy of influence may leave lasting harm rather than enduring respect. Marcello's enduring impact also extends to the cultural and historical record. Scholars, journalists, and historians have analyzed his career, noting his strategic brilliance, organizational acumen, and careful management of risk. At the same time, they have highlighted the societal consequences of his actions, reinforcing the importance of viewing organized crime within a broader ethical and social framework. Marcello's life thus provides both a case study in leadership and influence, and a cautionary tale about ambition divorced from moral responsibility. The final years also saw Marcello considering the long-term continuity of his empire. He focused on reinforcing the organizational culture he had cultivated: respect for hierarchy, loyalty to the network, strategic foresight, and disciplined risk management. By mentoring successors and emphasizing these principles, he ensured that the Southern Mafia would remain resilient even as the direct influence of its founder waned. This phase of leadership demonstrates the importance of preparing future generations, institutionalizing values, and creating systems capable of adaptation and survival beyond the tenure of any single leader. Marcello's personal reflections during this time were intertwined with the inevitable awareness of mortality. He recognized that his physical presence would not last forever, and that his true legacy would be measured by the stability of the organization, the lessons imparted to successors, and the broader societal understanding of his life's impact. This acknowledgement reinforces a timeless leadership principle. True legacy is not simply power or wealth, but the enduring structures, values, and ethical considerations that outlive an individual. In addition to organizational and ethical considerations, Marcello's final years highlighted the importance of humility in leadership. Despite decades of influence, he remained aware of the limits of personal control, the unpredictability of external forces, and the necessity of careful preparation for eventual decline. This humility did not weaken his authority; rather, it allowed him to exercise influence with foresight, restraint, and a focus on the long-term sustainability of his empire. Leaders in any field can draw lessons from this approach. The ability to step back, observe, and mentor is a hallmark of enduring influence. By the late 1990s, Marcello's active presence in the Southern Mafia had diminished, but his impact continued to be felt. The organizational structures, cultural norms, and strategic principles he had established remained central to operation. His life story offers an instructive model of resilience, strategic foresight, and disciplined leadership, alongside a cautionary perspective on the consequences of ambition and influence without ethical grounding. Communities, historians, and students of leadership can all draw lessons from the quiet emperor's life, both for its strategic brilliance and its moral implication. In conclusion, Carlos Marcello's final years illustrate the intersection of reflection, legacy, and the enduring impact of leadership. While stepping back from active operations, he ensured organizational continuity, mentored the next generation, and considered the ethical consequences of decades of influence. His story reinforces the dual lessons of power: that strategic brilliance and discipline can sustain influence for decades, but that ethical responsibility and awareness of societal impact are essential to a meaningful legacy. The Quiet Emperor's final years offer a compelling reminder that leadership is defined not only by operational success but by foresight, reflection, and the balance between influence and morality. As the 1990s gave way to the early 2000s, Carlos Marcello entered a period of quiet contemplation, observing the world he had once navigated with such intensity from a distance. The empire he had built over decades in New Orleans and the broader South had endured numerous challenges: federal investigations, political scrutiny, internal rivalries, but society itself was transforming in ways that even the most sophisticated criminal networks could not ignore. Marcello, now advanced in age, became both a historian of his own life and a student of the evolving patterns of crime, power, and societal change. Marcello watched as organized crime underwent significant transformation. The traditional mafia operations he had led, gambling networks, union influence, political alliances, were increasingly pressured by modern law enforcement techniques, technological advancements, and shifting societal norms. Federal agencies had become far more sophisticated, employing digital surveillance, cross-jurisdictional collaboration, and forensic accounting to dismantle networks that once operated with near impunity. Marcello recognized that the rules of influence and survival had shifted. The same discretion and strategic patience that had ensured success in the mid-20th century now required adaptation to a new, faster-moving world. This period of reflection also allowed Marcello to consider the broader societal context of his actions. He observed that communities, once largely unaware of the scope of organized crime, were now more vigilant and engaged. Public intolerance for corruption and exploitation had increased, while media scrutiny amplified the consequences of unethical leadership. These changes reinforced a vital lesson he had learned over decades: power, however cleverly managed, cannot exist in isolation from society. Influence carries responsibility, and the success of any enterprise, legitimate or illicit, is intertwined with the broader social environment. Marcello's reflections extended to the younger generation of organized crime figures who were rising in his absence. He noted that many of these successors lacked the strategic patience, discretion, and psychological insight that had been central to his own success. Ambition often overshadowed foresight, and impulsive actions sometimes invited law enforcement attention or internal conflict. While Marcello had carefully mentored several protégés, he recognized that the evolving nature of crime meant that even well-prepared successors faced unprecedented challenges. This awareness reinforced the importance of foresight, adaptability, and the ethical considerations that had long been secondary in the world of organized crime but were increasingly unavoidable. During these years, Marcello also reflected on the broader patterns of leadership and influence he had observed throughout his life. He understood that authority was most sustainable when grounded in strategy, discretion, and the careful management of human relationships. Commanding respect through fear alone was fleeting. Enduring influence required a combination of intelligence, observation, and the ability to anticipate human behavior. The Quiet Emperor's life demonstrated that organizational resilience depends on these principles, and his reflections emphasized that these lessons are applicable far beyond the criminal context in business, politics, and community leadership. Marcello's later years also offered an opportunity to contemplate the moral dimensions of power. While his operational brilliance had been undeniable, the societal consequences of his actions, the manipulation of unions, the exploitation of gambling networks, and the influence over political figures were unavoidable. He acknowledged that ambition pursued without ethical restraint carries lasting consequences, both for communities and for the legacy of the individual. This awareness did not erase the accomplishments of his life, but added a critical layer of introspection, highlighting the tension between operational success and moral responsibility. The transformation of the Southern Mafia in this era illustrates another key insight from Marcello's reflections. Adaptability is essential for organizational survival. While the core principles he had established, loyalty, compartmentalization, strategic delegation, remained intact, younger operators had to contend with new threats, including digital surveillance, heightened interagency coordination, and the globalization of organized crime networks. Marcello recognized that survival in this new era required a willingness to evolve, a lesson that extends to any organization confronting technological, regulatory, or cultural change. Marcello's personal life during these years was marked by quiet observation and selective engagement. He maintained contact with trusted associates, monitored developments within the organization, and provided guidance when necessary. Yet, he largely refrained from direct involvement, allowing the systems he had created to operate independently. This approach reflects a timeless principle of leadership. The most enduring influence often comes not from constant intervention but from careful design, mentorship, and the cultivation of capable successors. By stepping back, Marcello allowed the organization to adapt while ensuring that his principles of strategy, loyalty, and discretion remained central to its culture. The societal changes during this period also prompted Marcello to reflect on the consequences of unchecked ambition. Communities impacted by gambling, corruption, and political manipulation continued to recover and evolve, and the legal and ethical frameworks governing society had grown stronger. He understood that the long-term success of any enterprise, criminal or legitimate, depends not only on strategy but on alignment with societal norms and ethical standards. This realization reinforced the importance of considering the broader implications of power and influence, a lesson that remains relevant across disciplines. Marcello's reflections extended to the historical record. As journalists, historians, and academics examined the Southern Mafia and his role within it, he observed how his life had been interpreted, mythologized, and analyzed. He understood that history is shaped not only by facts but by perception, narrative, and context. His awareness of legacy, how future generations would remember him, reinforced his ongoing commitment to reflection, mentorship, and ethical consideration, even in the final years of his life. During this period, Marcello also considered the human elements of leadership. He noted that trust, loyalty, and psychological insight had been as critical to his success as operational skill or strategic foresight. Leaders who neglect these dimensions, whether in criminal organizations, business, or politics, risk organizational instability and failure. Marcello's reflections emphasize that enduring influence requires both strategic intelligence and a deep understanding of human behavior, a lesson that transcends the context of organized crime and applies broadly to all leadership roles. By the early 2000s, Marcello's influence, while diminished in direct operational terms, remained a guiding presence. The principles he had instilled, strategic patience, discipline, loyalty, compartmentalization, and foresight, continued to shape the Southern Mafia's operation. His story illustrates a fundamental truth about leadership and legacy. Influence is most enduring when it is institutionalized, codified, and passed on through mentorship, rather than dependent solely on personal presence or coercion. Marcello's reflections in this final period offer enduring lessons for leadership, ethics, and strategy. First, power and influence require careful cultivation, foresight, and adaptability. Second, ethical responsibility cannot be ignored, even in the pursuit of operational success. Third, mentorship and the cultivation of capable successors are essential for sustaining organizational longevity. Fourth, true legacy is measured not only by control or wealth, but by the enduring principles, structures, and ethical considerations imparted to those who follow. In conclusion, Carlos Marcello's reflections on societal change and the evolution of organized crime provide a compelling portrait of a leader at the intersection of strategy, ethics, and historical awareness. His observations underscore the importance of foresight, adaptability, and mentorship, while highlighting the moral dimensions of influence. The Quiet Emperor's insights remain relevant today, offering lessons on leadership, resilience, and ethical responsibility that extend far beyond the world of organized crime. In the early 2000s, as Carlos Marcello entered the final chapters of his life, he had become a figure as much defined by public perception and historical narrative as by the operations he had directed for decades. The quiet emperor of the Southern Mafia had once ruled in secrecy, his influence measured in the careful orchestration of gambling networks, union manipulation, and political alliances. By this stage, however, the world knew him differently. Journalists, historians, and documentary filmmakers had transformed his life into a story for public consumption, analyzing his achievements, scrutinizing his methods, and questioning the moral dimensions of his choices. Marcello's media portrayal was multifaceted. Some accounts emphasized his strategic brilliance, resilience, and ability to maintain organizational control over decades of scrutiny. He was often described as disciplined, patient, and intelligent, a man who achieved influence without overt violence or spectacle. Other narratives focused on the societal consequences of his empire, exploitation of communities, political corruption, and the perpetuation of illegal activity. These contrasting perspectives underscored a central truth about historical figures. Their legacy is always a blend of operational skill, ethical context, and societal interpretation. The media's fascination with Marcello also reflected broader societal interest in organized crime. Americans have long been captivated by the hidden mechanisms of power, the tension between legality and ambition, and the psychology of leaders who operate in secretive, high-stakes environments. Marcello's life embodied these themes, a careful, disciplined man whose influence was measured not in headlines or notoriety but in the subtle, long-lasting impact he exerted over his organization, allies, and the communities in which he operated. His story offered both intrigue and instruction, blending historical insight with the moral lessons of leadership and accountability. Marcello himself remained largely detached from these portrayals. Observing from a distance and reflecting on the way his life had been interpreted, he recognized that public perception often simplifies complex realities, emphasizing dramatic moments while overlooking the sustained strategic discipline and human intelligence required to build and maintain influence. This awareness reinforced a critical lesson about leadership. The perception of power is as important as its exercise, and public legacy is often shaped by narrative, symbolism, and selective memory, rather than purely by operational success. During this period, Marcello also considered the impact of his story on future generations. He was aware that students of history, criminology, and leadership would study his life, not only to understand organized crime, but to extract lessons about strategy, human behavior, and the consequences of unchecked ambition. This reflection highlighted the dual nature of legacy. Influence can inspire admiration for skill and foresight, but it must be contextualized within ethical considerations. Marcello's awareness of this tension underscored his growing understanding that history judges leaders not solely by effectiveness, but also by responsibility and impact. The Southern Mafia, as it existed under Marcello's supervision, continued to operate, though with less direct involvement from him. Younger members of the organization were guided by the principles he had instilled: loyalty, compartmentalization, strategic patience, and careful risk management. Marcello's influence had become institutionalized, shaping operational culture and decision-making without requiring constant personal oversight. This evolution demonstrates a critical principle of leadership. Enduring influence depends on building resilient systems, cultivating capable successors, and reinforcing organizational values that outlast individual presence. Public and media scrutiny also reinforced lessons in ethics and accountability. Marcello had long operated within a world where discretion and indirect influence protected him from legal and societal consequences. Yet, as historical records were compiled and media narratives proliferated, the full scope of his actions, including their impact on communities, political structures, and economic systems, became more visible. This illustrates an enduring truth: leadership, no matter how skillfully exercised, carries consequences beyond immediate control, and history often demands accountability long after the individual has departed. Marcello's reflections on these dynamics highlight the psychological dimensions of leadership and influence. He understood that power is not absolute, it is relational, dependent on perception, trust, and adaptability. Even in environments characterized by secrecy, risk, and moral ambiguity, sustaining influence required an acute awareness of human behavior, foresight, and the ability to anticipate external pressures. The Quiet Emperor's life demonstrates that strategic thinking, emotional intelligence, and operational discipline are intertwined, and that leadership is more enduring when these qualities are consistently applied. The societal impact of Marcello's empire also provides instructive lessons. Gambling operations, political influence, and union manipulation may have generated wealth and control for the Southern Mafia, but they also imposed costs on communities, undermined public trust, and reinforced cycles of corruption. Observing these outcomes, Marcello's later reflections emphasized the importance of considering the broader implications of influence. For leaders in any domain, the exercise of power requires not only strategic skill, but an understanding of ethical responsibility, social consequences, and long-term impact. Marcello's legacy in the media and public imagination further reinforced the value of narrative in leadership. Stories about his life were frequently dramatized, mythologized, and analyzed, providing both entertainment and education. These portrayals highlighted the tension between operational skill and moral consequence, showing how influence can inspire admiration while simultaneously cautioning against ethical lapses. Marcello's awareness of this dynamic reinforced a key leadership insight. Perception, reputation, and ethical conduct are inseparable elements of enduring influence. In addition to public perception, Marcello remained focused on practical mentorship. He continued to guide select associates, reinforcing principles of loyalty, discretion, and strategic decision-making. By balancing reflection with action, he ensured that his organizational influence persisted without requiring active day-to-day involvement. This phase of leadership highlights the critical importance of succession planning, cultural reinforcement, and the cultivation of capable successors in sustaining organizational resilience over time. Marcello also observed broader societal changes, including the decline of traditional organized crime structures and the emergence of new criminal models influenced by globalization, technology, and changing law enforcement tactics. He recognized that while the Southern Mafia had endured, it would need to adapt continually to survive. This observation underscores a universal lesson. Enduring systems, whether criminal networks, corporations, or social institutions, must evolve in response to changing environments, and leaders must anticipate these shifts to maintain relevance and stability. Reflecting on his life in the early 2000s, Marcello recognized that true legacy is defined not only by power or operational success, but by the lessons imparted to others. His story offers multiple dimensions of insight: the value of strategic patience, the importance of foresight, the necessity of ethical awareness, and the enduring influence of mentorship. These lessons extend far beyond the world of organized crime, providing guidance for leaders in business, politics, and civic life. In conclusion, Carlos Marcello's final public perception and media portrayal reveal the dual nature of influence. Operational brilliance and societal impact exist in tandem, and legacy is shaped by both achievement and ethical accountability. His story demonstrates that leadership is as much about guiding others, institutionalizing values, and reflecting on consequences as it is about personal skill or control. The Quiet Emperor's life offers timeless lessons on power, foresight, and responsibility, reminding us that influence carries both opportunity and obligation, and that the measure of true leadership lies in balancing strategy with morality. As Carlos Marcello entered the twilight of his life, he began to confront the inevitability of mortality, a reality that had always lurked in the background of his decades-long career in organized crime. For more than half a century, Marcello had operated in a world of secrecy, strategy, and high stakes, carefully balancing power, discretion, and human relationships. The threats of law enforcement, rival factions, and personal exposure had shaped every decision he made. Now, in his final years, the permanence of life's limits became an unavoidable lens through which he reflected on the consequences of his ambition, influence, and choices. Marcello's reflections on mortality were profound. He understood that, despite decades of meticulous planning, operational brilliance, and strategic foresight, no amount of skill could render him invulnerable to the passage of time. The Quiet Emperor, who had once navigated the perils of federal investigations, political intrigue, and internal betrayal with remarkable acumen, now faced a challenge that required no negotiation or deception: the finite nature of life itself. This awareness intensified his contemplation of legacy, responsibility, and the broader consequences of a life spent in the pursuit of power. Throughout these reflections, Marcello revisited the moral and ethical dimensions of his actions. While his strategic skill had allowed him to build a resilient criminal empire, he could not escape the societal repercussions of his decisions. Communities had been exploited, political systems manipulated, and unions influenced for decades. These outcomes, though often indirect, were undeniable, and Marcello recognized that ambition pursued without ethical restraint leaves lasting consequences. His life, therefore, became a lens through which to examine the complex intersection of power, responsibility, and morality. Marcello's contemplation of ambition extended to his own motivations. He had spent decades seeking influence, control, and stability within a dangerous, secretive world. This ambition had driven him to achieve remarkable operational success, survive numerous legal challenges, and maintain authority over the Southern Mafia longer than many of his contemporaries. Yet he also realized that ambition carries inherent risks, not only the immediate threats of law enforcement or rivals, but also the long-term impact on human relationships, communities, and historical legacy. This understanding reinforced a critical lesson: the pursuit of success must be tempered by ethical consideration and awareness of consequences beyond personal gain. During these final years, Marcello also reflected on the nature of leadership. He recognized that authority, influence, and operational control are not simply tools to wield. They are responsibilities to exercise with foresight and discipline. Leadership is measured not only by what one achieves, but by how those achievements impact others. Marcello's life demonstrates that power without accountability is inherently unstable, and that true influence is evaluated not only by operational results, but by ethical, social, and historical outcomes. Marcello's reflections were intertwined with the observation of generational change. He noted that the younger members of the Southern Mafia, while capable and ambitious, often lacked the patience, discretion, and psychological insight that had characterized his own leadership. While they inherited an operational framework reinforced over decades, the moral lessons and strategic discipline necessary for sustainable influence were more difficult to transmit. Marcello's awareness of this dynamic reinforced his commitment to mentorship, the institutionalization of organizational principles, and the ongoing reinforcement of ethical and strategic standards. Even as his direct involvement waned, the consequences of ambition, Marcello realized, extend beyond the individual. While personal skill and intelligence can generate power and success, the social, ethical, and human costs of those actions persist long after the immediate gains are realized. Gambling operations, political manipulation, and union influence had generated wealth and authority for the Southern Mafia, but they had also affected countless lives, institutions, and communities. Marcello's reflections on these outcomes underscore the critical importance of considering long-term consequences when exercising influence, a lesson that transcends criminal contexts and applies universally to leadership and organizational strategy. Marcello also contemplated the balance between visibility and discretion. Throughout his career, he had relied on careful observation, indirect influence, and compartmentalization to maintain authority. These principles had allowed him to avoid the violent downfalls that had ensnared many contemporaries, demonstrating that power exercised with patience and strategic foresight is more sustainable than power asserted through intimidation or impulsivity. In his final years, Marcello recognized that this balance of visibility, discretion, and strategic patience remained a defining feature of lasting influence, one that is applicable to leaders in all walks of life. Health and the limits of physical resilience were a constant reminder of mortality. The years of stress, vigilance, and constant strategic calculation had taken a toll, underscoring a universal truth: human life is finite, and even the most intelligent, disciplined, and strategic individuals are subject to the inevitability of age and bodily decline. For Marcello, this awareness reinforced his reflections on legacy. Power, influence, and operational success are temporary if not paired with ethical responsibility and thoughtful planning for the future. Marcello's contemplation of mortality also deepened his understanding of mentorship. He realized that one of the most enduring forms of influence is the transmission of knowledge, values, and strategic principles to those who follow. While operational control eventually passes, the lessons imparted to the next generation, the principles of foresight, discipline, ethical consideration, and human understanding, can endure. Marcello had spent decades shaping the culture of the Southern Mafia, reinforcing loyalty, discretion, and strategic thinking. In his final years, he understood that this cultural and intellectual legacy might outlive him more effectively than any individual decision or action. Reflection on mortality also brought clarity to Marcello's understanding of history. He recognized that the way his life would be remembered depended not only on his achievements but also on the interpretation of historians, journalists, and the public. Legacy is not determined solely by personal intention. It is shaped by the narrative constructed by society. This awareness reinforced his continued focus on the ethical dimension of influence, the importance of mentorship, and the long-term impact of strategic decisions on communities and institutions. Marcello's final reflections also encompassed the psychological and emotional dimensions of leadership. The constant vigilance, risk assessment, and management of human relationships over decades had created a profound understanding of human behavior. He recognized that intelligence, empathy, and the ability to anticipate others' actions were as essential to leadership as operational skill. These insights, developed in the context of organized crime, offer lessons applicable far beyond criminal networks, highlighting the universal principles of human influence, strategic foresight, and disciplined decision-making. Ultimately, Carlos Marcello's reflections in his final years offer enduring lessons about ambition, mortality, and the consequences of power. Ambition, when exercised without ethical consideration, can generate both personal success and long-term societal harm. Influence, when paired with foresight, mentorship, and moral awareness, can leave a lasting and constructive legacy. Marcello's life underscores the balance between operational brilliance and ethical responsibility, between ambition and reflection, and between immediate success and enduring impact. In conclusion, the Quiet Emperor's contemplation of mortality, ambition, and influence serves as a powerful educational narrative. His decades of experience navigating high-stakes environments, building resilient networks, and managing human behavior illustrate both the potential and the limitations of power. The lessons from his final years are clear. True leadership and lasting influence are defined not only by skill and achievement, but by ethical awareness, reflection, and the ability to mentor and shape the next generation. The life of Carlos Marcello offers a profound reminder that ambition must always be tempered by responsibility, foresight, and consideration of long-term consequences. In the late 2000s, Carlos Marcello's life entered its final stages, a period defined less by operational maneuvering and more by reflection, observation, and the physical limitations imposed by age. The Quiet Emperor, once the architect of an empire that spanned gambling, unions, and political influence across the South, now found himself grappling with the stark realities of decline. His body, weathered by decades of vigilance, stress, and high-stakes decision-making, reminded him that even the most disciplined, strategic life cannot escape the inevitability of time. Yet, even in this decline, Marcello's mind remained alert, thoughtful, and focused on the enduring consequences of his life's work. The Southern Mafia, the organization he had carefully cultivated over decades, continued to function under the guidance of younger lieutenants. Marcello had spent years mentoring these successors, emphasizing the importance of discretion, strategic foresight, and organizational resilience. While the operational details were no longer his direct concern, he monitored the broader trajectory of the organization, reflecting on whether his principles, loyalty, careful planning, patience, and subtle influence were being upheld. These final years highlighted the distinction between personal control and institutional legacy. A leader's lasting impact is measured less by active intervention than by the endurance of the systems and values they leave behind. Marcello's reflections during this period were increasingly philosophical. He considered the interplay between power, influence, and consequence, recognizing that the same ambition that had allowed him to build an empire had also created irreversible societal impacts. Communities had been affected by gambling operations, labor manipulation, and political interference. Families had been caught in cycles of exploitation and corruption. While he had long shielded himself from direct legal consequences, the ethical ramifications of his actions were impossible to ignore. In these quiet moments, Marcello confronted the duality of his legacy, operational brilliance coexisting with societal harm. Health concerns were a constant companion during this final stage of life. Decades of stress, vigilance, and responsibility for a vast, secretive network had taken a tangible toll. Marcello experienced the limitations of human endurance firsthand, confronting fatigue, declining strength, and the increasing vulnerability that comes with age. These physical realities underscored a universal truth. No matter the power accumulated or the intelligence exercised, the human body remains finite. For Marcello, this awareness intensified reflection on mortality, responsibility, and the lessons to be imparted to those who would follow. Even as his physical presence diminished, Marcello remained intellectually engaged. He continued to analyze the changing landscape of organized crime, noting the ways in which globalization, technology, and law enforcement innovation had reshaped the risks and opportunities for criminal networks. The Southern Mafia, while structurally resilient, faced unprecedented challenges. Surveillance technologies, federal task forces, and the digitization of financial systems demanded new forms of operational caution. Marcello observed these developments with the analytical mind that had guided him through decades of high-stakes decision-making, recognizing that adaptability is essential for any organization's survival. In private moments, Marcello also contemplated personal relationships. Loyalty, trust, and human connection had been central to his operational success, and in these final years he measured the impact of decades spent prioritizing strategy over intimacy. Friends, family, and associates had all been affected by the life he had chosen. Marcello reflected on how influence, while powerful, exacts costs not only on others but on the individual exercising it. These contemplations reinforced a broader lesson: leadership and ambition, however brilliant, must be balanced by awareness of the human and social consequences of one's choices. Marcello's final decline also provided clarity on the nature of historical legacy. He understood that his life would be analyzed, mythologized, and scrutinized long after his death. Media portrayals, scholarly studies, and public perception would frame his story in ways that combined fact, interpretation, and narrative construction. He realized that history is rarely neutral. It interprets human action through ethical, social, and cultural lenses. This understanding reinforced his commitment to reflection, mentorship, and the careful transmission of operational and ethical principles to his successors. Even as his personal influence waned, Marcello focused on shaping the narrative through education and example. The psychological weight of this stage was significant. A lifetime spent navigating secrecy, deception, and high-stakes negotiation had instilled acute awareness of risk and human behavior. Yet, in confronting mortality, Marcello experienced the limitations of strategy and foresight. No amount of preparation could alter the inevitability of life's end. This realization added urgency to his reflections on legacy, ethics, and the lessons of influence. He understood that his final contribution to society, the Southern Mafia, and the historical record would be determined less by new operational actions and more by the wisdom he had accumulated and transmitted over decades. Marcello's focus on mentorship in these years emphasized the human dimension of leadership. He provided guidance to younger operators not only on strategic and operational issues, but also on the ethical, social, and psychological dimensions of influence. He reinforced the principles that had guided his career: patience, discretion, foresight, and understanding human behavior. By emphasizing these elements, Marcello ensured that his organizational legacy would be shaped not only by operational continuity but also by the cultivation of responsible, strategic decision-makers who could adapt to changing circumstances while honoring foundational principles. During this final period, Marcello also contemplated the broader societal implications of organized crime. He recognized that the structures he had built, while resilient and strategically sound, had imposed cost on communities, institutions, and social trust. These contemplations reinforced the duality of leadership. Operational brilliance and influence are inseparable from the ethical, social, and moral consequences they produce. Marcello's reflections in these final years provide valuable lessons for students of leadership, strategy, and ethics, illustrating the necessity of balancing ambition with responsibility, foresight with morality, and operational success with societal impact. Marcello's final decline, therefore, was not merely a physical process. It was a period of profound reflection, assessment, and philosophical consideration. He evaluated the trajectory of his life, the structure and culture of his organization, and the lessons that would endure long after his passing. He observed how external pressures, legal, social, and technological, had transformed the landscape in which the Southern Mafia operated, underscoring the importance of adaptability, foresight, and mentorship. In these reflections, he distilled the essence of his experience. Influence is most enduring when it is paired with ethical awareness, cultural reinforcement, and strategic preparation for the future. Even as his presence diminished, Marcello's attention remained fixed on the continuity of his empire. Systems, networks, and operational principles were in place, allowing the organization to function without constant intervention. This final act of leadership underscores a universal lesson. True influence is measured not by personal visibility but by the resilience, adaptability, and ethical grounding of the institutions one leaves behind. Marcello's careful cultivation of organizational culture, mentorship, and strategic foresight ensured that his legacy would persist, providing guidance to successors and historical insight to observers. In conclusion, Carlos Marcello's final decline illustrates the inescapable interplay between mortality, ambition, and legacy. While operational skill and strategic brilliance defined his life, the ultimate measure of influence lies in the enduring impact on institutions, communities, and the next generation. The quiet emperor's reflections during these final years underscore the importance of mentorship, ethical responsibility, foresight, and adaptability. His story serves as a profound reminder that leadership, influence, and ambition must be exercised with consideration for both human and societal consequences. ensuring that legacy is defined not only by achievement but by responsibility and enduring wisdom. As Carlos Marcello approached the final days of his life, the world that had once revolved around power, strategy, and secrecy seemed to slow, allowing space for contemplation, understanding, and closure. The quiet emperor, who had spent decades orchestrating the operations of the Southern Mafia with unparalleled discretion and intelligence, now faced the ultimate reality that no strategy, no loyalty, and no influence could alter the inevitability of death. These final moments, Marcello's reflections became both deeply personal and profoundly educational, offering lessons on leadership, ambition, morality, and human consequence. Marcello's final period was characterized by a sense of calm, an almost meditative recognition of the life he had lived. The empire he had built, a network spanning gambling operations, union influence, and political manipulation, had endured through careful mentorship, organizational discipline, and strategic foresight. Younger lieutenants carried forward his principles: loyalty, patience, compartmentalization, and strategic decision-making. While his physical presence diminished, his influence remained encoded in the structures and culture of the organization. This underscores a critical leadership lesson. True power is sustainable not through constant control, but through the cultivation of capable successors and resilient systems. During these final days, Marcello reflected on the consequences of his ambition. The pursuit of influence had granted him extraordinary operational success, respect among peers, and a lasting place in criminal history. Yet he was acutely aware that ambition carried a dual burden. The Southern Mafia's operations had impacted countless lives, families caught in cycles of exploitation, communities affected by gambling, and civic institutions subjected to political interference. The quiet emperor's reflections emphasized that the true measure of leadership is not just in achievement, but in the awareness and management of its consequences. Ambition untempered by responsibility leaves an indelible mark that history and society will remember. Marcello also considered the lessons he could impart beyond the confines of organized crime. The principles that had ensured his operational survival: strategic patience, observation, risk management, emotional intelligence, and the careful management of human relationships, are universally applicable. Leaders in business, politics, and community life can draw from these lessons to understand the importance of foresight, mentorship, and the disciplined application of influence. Marcello's story illustrates that intelligence and strategy are only valuable when coupled with ethical awareness and long-term responsibility. The final phase of Marcello's life also highlighted the human costs of leadership. Decades of vigilance, negotiation, and management of high-stakes relationships had exacted a toll on his health, personal relationships, and emotional well-being. Isolation, stress, and the constant balancing of risk shaped his experience as much as any operational decision. Reflecting on these costs, Marcello recognized that ambition and influence, no matter how skillfully exercised, come with inherent human consequences. Understanding this duality between achievement and personal or societal cost is central to the educational value of his life story. In these reflective days, Marcello confronted mortality not with fear but with acceptance. He understood that, while life is finite, the influence one exerts, the systems one builds, and the lessons one imparts can extend far beyond personal existence. This recognition was both humbling and instructive. He saw that the Southern Mafia, while a product of a particular time and context, embodied principles of organization, loyalty, and strategic foresight that could endure beyond his own life. These enduring structures, shaped by decades of discipline, were a testament to the importance of foresight, mentorship, and ethical consideration in leadership. Marcello also spent time reflecting on public perception and historical narrative. By this stage, his life had been analyzed, dramatized, and interpreted in countless media portrayals, scholarly studies, and journalistic accounts. He recognized that history rarely tells a simple story. It interprets actions through cultural, ethical, and societal lenses. Marcello understood that his legacy would not be defined solely by operational skill or ambition, but also by the ethical consequences of his decisions, the societal impact of his actions, and the lessons that future generations could draw from his life. This awareness reinforced the educational value of his reflections. Influence must always be exercised with foresight, ethical awareness, and accountability. Even as Marcello faced the inevitability of his own death, he continued to emphasize the importance of mentorship. He imparted lessons on strategy, patience, discretion, and ethical reflection to the next generation of operators. By doing so, he ensured that the principles he valued, organizational resilience, loyalty, careful observation, and strategic foresight, would survive him. This aspect of his final days illustrates a universal truth about leadership. Enduring influence is not measured by personal visibility, but by the capacity to shape others and instill principles that outlast individual presence. Marcello's reflections also included broader societal lessons. The Southern Mafia's operations had affected communities, institutions, and public trust. These outcomes highlighted the consequences of unchecked ambition and the ethical responsibilities inherent in any position of power. Marcello's acknowledgement of these consequences emphasizes an educational perspective. Understanding history, leadership, and influence requires recognizing both the operational brilliance of individuals and the moral and social impact of their actions. This dual lens is critical for students of strategy, leadership, and ethics. Throughout these final days, Marcello maintained a focus on the balance between ambition, morality, and foresight. He understood that influence, whether exercised in business, politics, or organized crime, carries responsibilities that extend beyond immediate objectives. Decisions ripple outward, affecting human lives, communities, and historical interpretation. This understanding reinforced the lesson he had spent decades imparting: patience, observation, ethical reflection, and mentorship are essential components of enduring leadership. In contemplating his own mortality, Marcello also reflected on the universality of human experience. Ambition, influence, power, and legacy are themes that transcend the context of organized crime. All individuals, whether leaders in public life, business, or community organizations, face decisions that carry long-term consequences. Marcello's story, with its combination of strategic brilliance, ethical complexity, and societal impact, offers timeless lessons. Leadership requires foresight. Ambition must be balanced with responsibility, and legacy is defined by both achievement and ethical awareness. Ultimately, Carlos Marcello's life concluded quietly, reflecting the very principles that had guided him throughout his career: discretion, patience, and measured influence. He passed not in spectacle or public confrontation, but in reflection, having witnessed the endurance of the organization he built, the lessons imparted to the next generation, and the societal consequences of his decades-long ambition. The Quiet Emperor's story, therefore, is both a chronicle of operational brilliance and a cautionary tale about the ethical dimensions of influence, offering insights that extend far beyond the criminal world. In conclusion, the final chapter of Carlos Marcello's life emphasizes enduring lessons for leadership, ethics, and societal responsibility. Ambition without ethical awareness carries consequences. Influence is most sustainable when paired with foresight and mentorship, and legacy is measured not only by operational success, but by the moral and social impact of one's decisions. The Quiet Emperor's life stands as a powerful educational narrative, illustrating that strategic brilliance, patience, and foresight must always be balanced by ethical reflection and responsibility. In studying his life, we see both the potential, the limitations of influence, and the timeless importance of exercising power with wisdom, integrity, and consideration for future generations.